All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at our DES International Learning Lounge webinar series. This is, in fact, our third webinar since we first started, right?
Yeah.
So today, we'll be focusing on how we can better support students in math through specialist teaching. So math can be a challenging subject for many students, right? So it's not just about, learning the content, but also the building of confidence, managing the anxiety, as well as, understanding the learning differences in learning math, right? So in this webinar, we will be sharing about why students struggle with math. All right, and the underlying reasons and what we can do to help them learn math better, right? So we also want to share about specialist teaching, how it offers a different approach in supporting not just the performance of our children, but also our students' ability in terms of understanding and also their growth. And also, what makes specialist teaching unique is that it is not just about teaching the mathematical concepts, but also teaching the child how to learn math. So I'm joined by three of our specialist teachers who bring a wealth of experience in supporting students with diverse learning needs. All right, so first we have Hamada.
Hello.
So Hamada is our senior specialist teacher at the DAS International, as well as a lecturer at the DAS Academy. And then we have Najima.
Hi, everyone.
So Najima is our specialist teacher at the DAS International, as well as an educational therapist at the DAS Math program.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we have Matthew.
Hello.
So Matthew is our senior specialist teacher at the DAS International, as well as a senior educational therapist at the DAS Math program. So let's start off with our first question. All right. Many parents wonder why their child struggle with math despite practice. Right? So from your experience, perhaps Najima can start first. What are some common underlying challenges?
Okay, I would say one of the key factors will be the gap between conceptual understanding and procedural knowledge. Many students can solve math problems, but surprisingly, they don't always understand why their methods work. This gap is often the root cause for confusion, mistakes, and even math anxiety.
Right. I think you have raised a really important point here. So could you share a little bit more about this with our audience?
Yeah, definitely. Procedural knowledge is about knowing how to do something which involves steps, rules, and algorithms. For example, they can memorize formulas like area is length times breadth. They can follow the steps for similar questions, and repetitive work comes very easy for them. These students, they can perform well in routine exercises because they are good at following steps. But the problem comes when the question is slightly changed, they tend to get stuck, or if the question requires them to work backwards to derive the answer, they'll get stuck. This is because they are actually relying on memorized procedures without truly understanding the underlying concept behind it.
Right, that's right. So our students are often taught to memorize procedures, right?
Yeah.
Often through drills and through practices, because it is fast and it actually saves a lot of time, of course. But very often they don't fully understand why they are doing it, and they end up not being very confident in explaining why they are doing these steps, right? So can you explain more about why conceptual understanding is so important?
Conceptual understanding is about knowing why our method works. It involves making connections between formulas, understanding the relationship between two formulas, and seeing a bigger picture. Why do we rename in addition, or even realizing that fractions actually represent parts of a whole? For instance, we are going to see two scenarios with two different topics. Yeah. The first scenario is a student may know how to solve a question of 23 plus 19, but they may not understand place value, as they may have problem when it comes to renaming. Without a solid understanding of place value, the student may not realize that 23 is actually made up of 2 tens and 3 ones, and 19 is made up of 1 10 and 9 ones. So when adding these together, Adding 3 ones and 9 ones together is going to give us 12 ones, which has to be renamed as 110 and 2 ones. Instead, they just follow a memorized rule. They write 2 and they carry 1. This becomes problematic when the student encounters renaming or regrouping in a more complex situation, when they truly don't understand that 10 ones can be actually exchanged for 110. They may forget when or why they carry, or even they can misplace the carried digit, and they can struggle with subtraction that requires renaming. Example, 32 minus 18. And they become confused when the problem is presented in a different manner, in a different way, like example in a chunky word problem, or example if they are so used to having visual models, and if they don't have a visual aided model, they get lost. Now let's go to the second scenario when a student is solving a fraction question. Example, the question is 102 plus 103. A procedural learner might memorize the steps for fractions, such as when they have to find a common denominator before they can add the numerators together. But if you ask the student, why do we need to make the denominator the same? They may not know how to explain or answer the question. Whereas a conceptual learner, however, understand that fractions actually refer to equal sized parts. So we need a common denominator before adding the numerators together. Once they understand these concepts, they can apply the procedures more confidently, and their learning towards mathematics will be more positive.
Right. Thanks,
Yeah.
Najima. So what you're saying here is that when students rely on procedural knowledge rather than conceptual understanding, they form a gap between the two, right? Which then limits their ability to apply their knowledge flexibly and also confidently, right? So so what do you think is the issue with the gap here?
Yeah, actually, the widening gap between conceptual understanding and procedural knowledge creates 3 main problems. Number 1, their learning becomes very fragile. Whatever they learn, they tend to forget very easily. Number 2, they become inflexible. It's the inflexibility. They can't adapt to new questions. Example, if the question is portrayed in a different way, or if the question requires them to work backwards, they are not able to solve it. They tend to get stuck. And lastly is the low confidence. They feel lost when something looks different. When the word problem gets chunky, they are like, okay, it's too difficult. I'm not trying.
That's right.
Yes.
Okay.
What about you, Matthew?
Okay, another challenge will be their working memory, because doing math requires working memory. Because students need to retain information in their heads. After that, they need to process and then manipulate that information. And after that, retrieve number facts to work out the sums. Now, as students with poor working memory will struggle with such multi-steps and multi-information. So they need bite-sized instructions. Okay, they may also have difficulties with the language that we use in math, because math has its own language.
True.
Especially in word problems, such as understanding mathematical vocabulary, identifying relevant information, and then deciding which mathematical operation to use. Okay, so for example, a student is given a word problem, right? Okay, Sarah has 24 apples. She gives nine apples to her friends, and then she buys 15 more apples. How many apples does she have now? So the student with weaker working memory may struggle because they need to hold multiple pieces of information. Right? First, they have to hold. She has 24. She gave away 9, and she bought another 15. Then they have to process the sequence of events. Okay, first they have to add, subtract first, and then add. Okay, so they also have to understand vocabulary. Like gears means what? To subtract. Buy small means to add. So they might forget one of these numbers, or they may mix up the order of operations. Instead of adding first, they may subtract first, or instead of subtract first, they may add first. And not recognizing which operation each phrase represents. So as a result, instead of solving it as 24 minus 9 plus 15 equals 30, they may produce an incorrect answer due to cognitive overload or misunderstanding of the language. Now, this illustrates how both working memory, demands, and language comprehension can affect the student's ability to solve even relatively simple math problems.
Right, indeed. Working memory is an important skill for processing math and solving math problems, right? Najima earlier mentioned about math anxiety, right? So Hamada, have you met students who are like that?
Yes, I have met students with math anxiety. I think some things that we tend to overlook is how all these difficulties combined, what Matthew and Najima have shared, all of this can lead to math anxiety. Can you imagine the constant daily struggle during math lessons and how that impacts their self-esteem? I mean, think about anyone experience any sort of failure once, right? Already has their self-esteem affected. But when a learner experiences it enough times, it causes repeated failure that will then lead them to switching off entirely. And I've seen that in my students. You know, they'll see a word problem sum, more than 3 lines. They say, I cannot, it's too hard, I don't want to do, right? And then they switch off. Despite having gone through that concept, despite the child being able to read. Okay, so they might also display task avoidance behavior, things like their stomach suddenly hurts. And yes, I know, I don't know about you. Have you seen this in your classes?
Yes.
And it's easy to dismiss, right? If we don't understand the child, it's easy to dismiss them as just being dramatic, right? They're creating all sorts of excuses. But what it really is math anxiety. And so past year papers or assessment books alone is not going to be effective in supporting them because the root of the issue is not addressed.
Right. Thanks, Hamada, for raising that. So math anxiety is really very real, right? For many of our students who struggle with mathematics. So from what we have discussed here, it is clear that success in learning math is not just about putting in more effort or doing more practices, you know. It is about how the child understands the concepts, being able to process information, as well as, you know, developing that confidence in their learning. So let's now help our audience understand a little bit more about how you support these students in your classrooms. Okay, so maybe we can start with Hamada. Okay. So can you share an example of a strategy that you use to help students understand a difficult concept?
Okay, when it comes to difficult concepts, we are very big on using concrete materials to explain abstract concepts. A lot of times, why is a concept difficult? It's because it's abstract, right? And so between concrete and abstract, we make that link very clear to our learners. So take, for example, right, I'll bring your attention to the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. When a child comes across having to simplify a ratio of 3:9, for example, the child will be able to then visualize conceptually what that may look like. Okay, so in this example, you'll see these group of dinosaurs. Okay, so because we've done that, when it was introduced, that link was made, or these drawn out circles, right? You see 1:3. Otherwise, if they don't have something to fall back on, they're just going to end up seeing 2 numbers, 3 and 9, just separated by 2 dots or a colon, right? And they'll end up solving problems just by merely following steps, procedures, just like what Najima shared earlier, and that's not sustainable for our students if they don't have the understanding of the concept of that topic. Similarly, you might have topics like rate and proportion, and I'll bring your attention to the top left corner of the screen. And these are essentially fractions or ratios depending on how you choose to solve it, right? So then maybe you might think, okay, well, what concrete materials can I use then, right? So abstract. So we can also get the child to experience that concept in the first place. Things like, how many steps do you take in every 100 meters? So in this example, or in when I was faced with that in my class, I invited them to use a measuring tape, and they really take those steps, right? So they're experiencing that. And there's another one, right? We can invite them to
look at or time themselves. How many words can you copy in 30 seconds? So literally putting a timer in front of them while they copy that paragraph, elaborating on rain, for example, right? So that way, such an abstract concept or something that sounds so complex becomes relatable. And then in turn, it becomes more accessible to them. Najima or Matthew, what about you? Some concrete materials that you personally enjoyed or you use in your class?
Okay, I was just using these fraction magnets. As you can see here, sorry, this is half of the one whole, and then this is a third. Can you all see? Okay, no, for the audience. So this is the 1/6. So these are these manipulative magnets here we use during our DAS classes. Students are able to see these concrete version of fractions, and they can physically touch it, manipulate it, and how they understand how these fractions are actually equal sized parts. They can see that we have to make them equal size before we can add them or subtract them. Now we can try to use the same example which I mentioned earlier on. 1/2 plus 1/3. When introducing a problem like that, it is important to help students see that fractions are not just numbers that we can manipulate. They are quantities that can be renamed in different but equivalent ways. For example, 1/2 can also be written as 3/6. Let me show you that. You see 3/6.
Overlap.
Yes.
Right?
And then I can overlap this and show you. Yes. And then 1/3 can be also written as 2/6. This introduces the subtopic of equivalent fractions. Fractions that look different but they represent the same value. You can guide students by asking them a question. Why do we have to choose 6 as the denominator? Why can't we choose 12? Or why can't we choose another number like 24? This prompt then encourages thinking rather than just memorizing. Students can be led to understand that in order to add the fractions, the parts must be the same size, meaning same denominator. We look for a common multiple of 2 and 3, and then usually we look for the smallest common multiple of 2 and 3, so that the smaller the number, the easier they can manipulate and solve the answer. Using 6 is helpful because it's the lowest common multiple, making the number smaller and the process simpler for the students to work with. Once students understand this, they can confidently rename the fractions, and through this approach, students move beyond just finding a common denominator as a rule, and instead they understand that they are renaming fractions into equal sized parts that can be combined meaningfully.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. Thanks, Samada and Najima, for your sharing. The strategies that you have shared here, in fact, help students to see the link between the concrete representation with the abstract representation in math. So using visual models to understand and sequence the steps, right, that are required to solve word problems actually also taps on the cognitive load. So by using manipulatives like this, when you get them to touch and feel and kind of make sense, right? The sensory touch and making sense of how all these math concepts are concretized in front of them. I think that helps with reducing the cognitive load, which Matthew have earlier mentioned about working memory, right? You need that cognitive load to process and manipulate information. So I think just like what Matthew have shared about the association between that working memory and solving mathematical problems. All right, so Matthew, I think you have been actually supporting secondary school students, right? So as our students progress, math concepts are getting more and more abstract. And also as they get older, manipulatives may not work that well for them, or the students may find that concrete materials like what Najima has shared here may not be that relevant to them, right? So how can we support our students who progress on to secondary school?
Okay. As students transition from primary to secondary mathematics, they move away from visual-based problem solving, example, the model method, to more abstract algebraic reasoning, To support this shift, we adopt a structured and scaffolded approach that bridges visual understanding to abstract thinking. Right? Okay, so firstly, we explicitly connect visual representation to algebra. All right. So, for example, students are guided to translate bar models into algebraic expressions and equations. Okay, helping them see algebra as a natural progression or extension of what they already understand, right? Rather than a completely new concept.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you look at this example, Jason is X years old. Kenny is 3 years older. How old is Kenny? Now, if you are not using X to represent the number of years, if Jason is 5 years old, the students looking at the model will know how to add 5 plus 3 equals to 8 for Kenny's age. But in this case, in algebra, all they have to do is use X plus 3, and that will be the answer. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So in fact, bar modeling that students actually learn in primary school is like a conceptual or a concrete representation of algebra, right?
Correct. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. So what other ways can we support our secondary school students?
Okay. Secondly, we emphasize step-by-step problem-solving frameworks. Students are taught consistent methods such as identifying knowns and unknowns, right? So knowns will be your numerical number, and unknowns will represent them with a letter. Okay. So defining variables, forming equations, and checking solutions. This structured approach reduces cognitive load, right? And students with weaker working memory can cope. Okay. Thirdly, we continue to use visual supports where appropriate, such as diagrams, flowcharts, and annotated examples, even at secondary level. Okay, this serves as an intermediate bridge between concrete and fully abstract reasoning. Okay, you look at this class activity, right, which we introduced to our secondary 1 student when we talk about the concept of algebra. So we have this red circles, they're actually discs. We call them algebra discs. And we use them to help them write algebraic expressions, representing scenarios using these discs. Okay, the situations here are independent of one another. Therefore, they will always start in this exercise with the main sentence. Right, for example, Ryan has $2 at first. And the next scenario will be his mother gave him $1, right? So they will write the algebraic expression 5x plus $1. If they can't write that, we can ask them to use the algebra to represent this expression, right? So we will guide them through the first few questions, and after that, it will allow them to do independent practice.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It is interesting how you try to, form that link for our secondary school students. So you can actually, in fact, see how what our students used to learn in primary school can actually be explicitly linked to what they learn in secondary school. However, they do need our support, right? To build that bridge between what they already know and what they are learning, right? So I can see how much effort all 3 of you have put in to bridge, our students' gap between procedural knowledge and conceptual understanding, as well as supporting their working memory challenges in learning math. So let's go on to, talk a little bit more about math anxiety. We earlier on spoke about students having math anxiety, right? Despite that they're able to read, they're able to apply some of the concepts, but they are often held back because of anxiety. So let's share about how you can support students who have lost confidence in math. Hamada.
For a child who's lost confidence in math, we have to work on rebuilding their self-competence and the belief that they have of themselves. And this has to be done gradually, but also very intentionally as well. So what might that look like in class? So we're breaking tasks into more manageable steps, and we have to adjust the level so students can access the question. Right? And the goal is not about making it easy. You might think like, oh, that's not linked to what they do in school. That's not applicable because it's too easy. No, but what we're doing is you're making it achievable with that support. So when students experience success, even in smaller parts of the question, that will then allow them to have that mindset shift. From initially, they're thinking, I can't do this, it's too hard. And then they're moving to, I don't mind trying this. Let me try it by myself, right? And so by doing this, what we're allowing is giving them opportunities to experience small wins as much as possible. So we design tasks where students can experience these quick, visible progress. So for example, instead of giving them a full-on chunky word problem, right? Earlier on, Najima talked about how these chunky word problems can be very off-putting, but we can format it such that instead of that one whole chunk, we split it up into the 4 subparts and allowing them to slowly attempt it with guidance. And when those steps feel more automatic, we can perhaps collapse it into two subparts, right? And then when we start slowly weaning them off of that guidance, we can then finally collapse it into that one whole chunky word sum. So this is what I mean by gradually building. And so each success at every stage is also acknowledged, and we have to help them rebuild that momentum and confidence, but over time.
Yes, over time. How about you, Najima? How do you actually support your students?
Actually, I make a conscious effort to reframe their mistakes as useful information that we can gather rather than a failure. Instead of focusing on what went wrong, I guide students to see what the mistake is telling us about their thinking or processing skill. For example, an error might reveal a misunderstanding of a place value concept or a gap in a certain concept. Then when students begin to view mistakes this way, their fear of being wrong will then diminish. Then they will become more willing to participate or even troubleshoot their own errors and see which part they went wrong. And they will take risk, and they can even share their ideas openly. In addition, I make my thinking visible by modeling the problem-solving process out loud. I don't just demonstrate the correct answer on the board or anything. I will show them what it looks like to be a little unsure, to check my work, to counter-check between steps, or even try a different method or strategy when something doesn't work. This will then help students understand that struggle and uncertainty is actually a very natural part of learning, and they are not signs of incapability. It normalizes the idea that even confident learners, even teachers, parents, we pause, we rethink, and then we adjust accordingly. I also intentionally create opportunities for discussion in classroom where students can explain their reasoning and learn from one another during our group classes. When they hear different approaches and realize that others may think differently or even make similar mistakes, it builds a sense of shared learning rather than individual pressure on the child. Ultimately, my goal is to cultivate an emotionally sound environment in the class where students feel safe to try, supported in their efforts, and encouraged to persist. Over time, these consistent experiences help students rebuild not only their mathematical skills, but also their confidence. They begin to see themselves as capable learners who can grow, improve, and succeed through their efforts and understanding.
That's right. All right. Thanks for sharing. I mean, I like the fact, how Hamada and Najima, both of you have shared about, breaking tasks into smaller manageable steps, right? And modeling thinking. And I think then letting students know that, there is actually a thinking process. There are going to be some doubts. And after that, you need to figure out what are the right steps. Things like that actually contributes to creating a safe space for our students to explore and also learn through exploration as well, right? So in fact, we not only support students in terms of building up their conceptual understanding, but we also work on their emotions as well as their confidence.
Yes,
So
that's
this
right.
brings us to the next question that we're going to talk about. All right. So parents often say that, they have sent their children for multiple tuition or enrichment classes, but it doesn't seem to work at all. Right. So let's share with them more about what exactly is specialist teaching in math. What do we do? Matthew.
Okay. See, what sets us apart is the Autumn-Gillingham approach we apply in the classroom. Okay, this approach is structured, sequential, and multisensory. Right, that explicitly teaches concepts in small, manageable steps. Instructions is diagnostic and individualized, allowing us to adapt lessons based on each student's needs while reinforcing learning through repetition and guided practices. Now, the 6 key principles of the Autumn-Gillingham principles are: 1, language-based. Okay, instruction focuses on the structure of language, including math language here. So it's cognitive. Teaching is intentional and explicit, helping students understand the why behind concepts. Okay, learners are then guided to think about patterns, rules, and connections, strengthening reasoning and metacognition, rather than rote memorization.
Right. True.
Okay, the third principle is structured, sequential, and cumulative. Now, content is taught in a logical order, from simple to complex. And each new skill builds upon previously learned skills. Concepts are continuously reviewed, so learning is reinforced and retained over time. And it's also simultaneously multisensory, right? Okay, students will be engaged in visual, auditory, tactile pathways all at the same time. Okay, and it is also diagnostic and prescriptive. By that we mean teaching is responsive and individualized. Right? The teacher constantly assesses the students' understanding and adjusts instruction accordingly, targeting gaps, okay, and reinforcing weak areas, and pacing based on the learner's needs. In other words, as fast as the student can, as low as the student can. And then finally, emotionally sound. Okay, so the learning environment, like what Najima said, has to be in a safe environment, right? So it is supportive, encouraging, and success-oriented. Okay, lessons are designed to build confidence, reduce anxiety, and motivate students. Especially important for those who may have experienced repeated difficulty or failure.
Yes, Matthew, I agree with you. Usually, a DAS specialist teacher and a trained tutor, we both might be able to help students learn, but they may be a little different in their training and their approach and purpose. In DAS, we are trained to work with students with dyslexia, dyscalculia, and other learning challenges. Our focus is mainly to bridge the gaps which they already face in school. Our approach is tailored specially to cater to the needs of the child rather than one size fits all. And our teaching style methodologies include multisensory instead of just worksheet based, which can be a bit dry. Focusing on their underlying learning gaps, example, place value, understanding word problems. And because our ST specialist classes are one-on-one, there's no pressure on the child that he or she has to finish up the work because their peers have completed all the work and all that. And we also want the child to know that it is okay to learn at your own pace. We like to reiterate that having a strong foundation is also very important for learning, especially because dyslexic learners often struggle with abstract symbols, but they learn better through seeing and learning and touching, or even physical concrete materials.
That's right. Yeah.
In our classroom at DAS, we teach a child how to learn and help them catch up right at the root level.
That's right.
Yeah. I agree with you, Najima. Building on those points that you've shared, when we talk about how the lesson is individualized, right? Just now, Matthew mentioned one of the Orton-Gillingham principles is diagnostic and prescriptive, right? So individualized also means that we are creating these resources and crafting lessons that are specific to that learner based on these gaps that we've identified. And we identify them through conducting error analysis, and this will then inform us of our approach or the direction of our intervention. So say, for example, right, if I'm supporting two different students who are struggling with simplifying fractions, the support we provide can look entirely different. So through error analysis, for example, student A, their difficulties may stem from a lack of understanding the concept of fractions. But student B struggles in remembering the procedure to simplify fractions. So yes, we are looking at the same topic, but how the support that is provided to them is going to be entirely different in terms of their approach, right? Matthew earlier also mentioned simultaneously multisensory as one of the principles. In our classes, this is seen in the CRA approach that we use, the concrete, R for representational, and A for abstract, and where we simultaneously, and that's a very important point that I would like to highlight here, simultaneously place these three forms, C, R, and A, for our students to understand, and they're shown at the same time. So say, for example, right, what you see on your screen, a garden has 4 rows of flowers with 3 flowers in each row. How many flowers are there? So you see the concrete part is these are things using manipulatives, okay, things around your house that's possible as well. The representational is the picture form of it, and the abstract is basically the numbers, okay? So we're not doing it at separate stages where, okay, let's just look at the concrete and then we're going to count all together. Then after that, we move on to representational. We're doing it all at the same time. So they can explicitly see that link, how the concrete will then link to the representational, which then links to the abstract. So at any point in time, if they're confused, they are able to fall back on these respective stages to recall what do these numbers mean. Okay, so we're also very mindful to not be too quick to wean them off of the manipulatives if they're not ready for it. We guide them to independence. We do, but we have to do it progressively and in stages as well. We also assess their readiness to learn a particular topic or method. So we must consider whether specific approaches are in fact suitable based on their learning profiles. We might think, this approach worked with student A, but we have to analyze what is student B's profile and will this approach work for student B? We cannot just copy paste, okay? So if a child doesn't have that conceptual understanding, for example, we won't teach shortcuts, okay? And we'll in fact work on their conceptual understanding of that topic. So all of this feeds into what we call the individualized education plan that we create for each student. That's what you see here, okay? And it's essentially this document that captures everything I've just described, from the gaps to the tailored approach to the goals that we're working toward together. So what we're doing is we're meeting each and every student where they are at, and we're designing our lessons specifically for their profile.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, Hamada. I'm actually glad that you mentioned about IEP here, because audience who have actually listened to our previous webinars would know that we develop IEP for every student that we support. And this whole IEP involves 4 stages, which is the assessment of needs, the planning of goals, the implementation of lessons that aligns with the goals, and then also to evaluate the students' progress. So therefore, specialist teaching is not a one-size-fits-all way of supporting students. And we have to work very closely with parents to ensure that specialist teaching is intentional, responsive, and highly individualized for every child, just like what you all have mentioned here. Okay. So also, because students may only come for classes once a week, and therefore sorry, I'm hearing some echo here. Give me a while. Okay. Also, because students only come once a week, right? So how can we ensure that students don't forget what they have learned? Many parents want to help, right? But they are not sure how. So what are some practical ways parents can actually support their child at home?
Parents are actually urged to work closely with the specialist teacher to reinforce what's being taught in the DES class. It's also important to encourage them to use positive language at home because children tend to pick up phrases from adults very easily. Example, I'm not a math person, I'm not good with numbers. Instead, they can model affirmation by saying things like, that's a challenging one. Let's do it together. Let's figure this out together. Or when the child makes a mistake, oh, it's okay to make mistakes. That's how we learn together, right? This kind of positive affirmation creates a safe space for the students to make errors at home and can really boost a child's confidence. It would also be wonderful if parents could shift their focus a little more towards the effort and the progress rather than just focusing on the results, and praising their persistence, like, I like how you keep trying, I'm proud of you. Your effort is amazing. These kind of words can really help the child to build up the resilience, and child will be able to see math in a hopeful light. To sum it all up, parents just have to ensure that they have a conducive environment where the child feels supported, self-assured to attempt questions and not be scared of making mistakes.
That's right. Yeah. So that is right, Najima. So using positive language does help with changing the child's negative mindset towards
Correct.
learning, right?
Yeah.
So how about you, Hamada?
I would suggest using everyday math when you're supporting them with homework or if you're practicing together. And the concrete materials you use don't have to be flashy and expensive. Okay, I know Najima earlier showed you the magnets, so you don't have to feel like, oh, if I don't have these magnets, I can't support my child at home. No, you still can. You can think of what you have at home that your child can relate to, right? Your Ninjago figurines, your Legos, your magnet tiles. You can use candy as an incentive, right? All of these things can be used in supporting them. You can also incorporate more math thinking into your day-to-day interactions as well. Oftentimes there's this disconnect, math is a subject and you don't know how to relate that in your daily life. And so that's where we come in, right? You can take them, you can do it when you're making your trips to the supermarket, when you're cooking together or you're planning a family outing. It doesn't always have to be calculation. Again, we think math is just a subject of numbers, right?
Yeah.
But it's also a language in itself. And that's a big part of math that is often overlooked, right? Things like, oh, what's the proportion for this recipe if we're doubling it? So then in that case, in that context, we're introducing the term proportion, right? Or at the supermarket, which pack is better value? Or realizing that maybe, hey, how come suddenly these bag of chips are so much more expensive now? You can figure out what's that percentage increase when you see this. So when someone says things like, oh, if the percentage increase is now 5%, that number now makes sense, right? So practicing and supporting math really goes beyond studying at the table or with revision books. You take it into the real world as well.
Thanks for sharing that, Hamada. I do agree that math is indeed part of our everyday life, right? We can't run away from math.
Yes, we can.
It's really important that we help children take math learning into the real world, so that they can see like what happens in the classroom. They can actually apply it in the real world as well.
Otherwise, it's just separate.
It's just separate, right? I mean, they will think that, why do I need to learn fractions? Right? But actually, fractions is important when it comes to sharing, and especially you share a slice of pizza with everybody and things like that. So okay. So let's move on to talk about older students. Okay, Matthew, right? Okay. So what can parents do if their children is older at home?
Okay. One thing you can actually do, which I feel is very important, is to encourage your child to explain their thinking step by step when solving math problems. Because when they explain their thinking process, here is where you can actually identify exactly where they are weakening, where there are gaps, and where they can be strengthened. Right. So this helps you understand what they know, how they are reasoning, and where they may be confused, allowing you to provide more targeted support, right, while strengthening their understanding. Okay, you can also ask them guiding questions. Example, why did you choose this method? Right? Sometimes, right, I find that some students comes up with methods that is really weird. Right? It's all of this world. But I do not discourage them because you have to encourage them to
Think out of the
think
box,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I may ask them, okay, what could you try next? Right, since this doesn't work, what else can you do?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so instead of just immediately giving them the answers, okay, so you will help the child develop independence and deeper problem solving skills.
Yeah.
Right, so this also reduces reliance on memorization, right, and supports working memory by breaking tasks into manageable steps, and builds the child's confidence in tackling unfamiliar problems.
That's right. Yeah. Thanks, Matthew, for sharing that. Indeed, guiding questions does help with developing the child's thinking skills. And in fact, metacognition, right? Which is the awareness of your own thinking, is an important skill for math. Because when you ask a child like, oh, why do you choose this method? Can you show me how you come about this answer? When they try to explain to you, they are thinking about their own thinking, right? And they're like, why did I choose this step? And then you will ask the next question like, what else can we try next, right? So that actually kind of like help, guide the students through in terms of processing information. And when we talk about students with poor working memory as well, they have difficulty processing those information in their head. So by speaking it out, it actually helps with that, offloading of cognition, as well as being able to be more fully aware and appreciative of the steps required for solving that mathematical problem. So I do hope that parents in the audience here bear these great tips that three of them here have shared. Bear these great tips in mind when you help their children at home, right? Okay, so now let's come back to specialist teaching again. So we often wonder, like, oh, so how would my child benefit from specialist teaching in math? So can we share with our audience here, like, what are some of the signs that can tell us that the child may actually benefit well from our one-on-one specialist teaching in mathematical supports?
Actually, there are several signs that may suggest that a child could benefit from one-on-one teaching support in math. One key sign is persistent gaps despite the effort. The child may be attending extra lessons, completing work, and even receiving remediation from school, and yet still struggling with foundational concepts like place value, number sense, or basic operations. This often indicates the issue is not the effort that the child is putting, but how the concept is being understood and processed. And another important sign is when group classes doesn't work for the child. In most classroom settings, generally most group settings, teaching is paced for the majority of the students. So which then means that sometimes they will move too quickly for a student with already existing foundational gaps. So it will be too fast for the child. So when these key concepts are not fully understood, every new topic is building on a shaky ground. So over time, this can lead to a child feeling increasingly confused, overwhelmed, and even described as falling behind or even drowning in the lesson. So as their confidence drops, the child may disengage, become passive, and totally avoid participation at all. So for some students, especially those with specific learning difficulties, a more complex learning needs, a more personalized approach is essential. What do you think, Matthew? Is there another key sign that we must actually look out for?
One sign that you can look out for is whether they are able to cope with abstract concepts, especially in algebra. Because in algebra, mathematical statements and equations are very abstract. So if the child struggles to form equations or manipulate algebraic expressions or understand variables, even if they perform adequately in primary school using more concrete or visual methods. We also look out for their difficulty in transferring learning. Right. For example, they might be very successful completing familiar question types, but become stuck when the same concept is presented in a different form,
Yeah, correct.
right? Such as in word problem or real life context.
Yeah.
True.
Okay, this suggests that their understanding may be more procedural than conceptual, highlighting the need for explicit, structured instruction to develop deeper understanding and flexible problem-solving skills.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
I would say mine. I feel like my observation rides a lot on what Najima has shared. If you observe that they need a lot of scaffolding and guidance in these group classes, then you realize, okay, they've been doing all these drills, all the assessment books. Practice is very frequent, but for some reason, it's not supporting them enough, right? And again, back to the group classes. If you find that they're struggling a lot, you really have to pay close attention, because sometimes it shows up very subtly. Earlier on we spoke about math anxiety, the stomach ache, but sometimes it's more subtle than that, right? Not so big on the actions. They could be just like, oh, I don't know, but they haven't even tried anything, or they don't even attempt the questions unless you're there, or they are avoiding the task altogether. And that's really, again, like Matthew mentioned, a result of those repeated struggles that's chipped away at their confidence over time. And when that confidence takes a hit, it creates this barrier to simply accessing the learning of math. So if you notice that their self-esteem is being affected, or that anxiety around math has become a pattern, then that's a sign worth paying attention to, and you may want to consider one-on-one ST math support.
Right, okay. Right, thank you so much for sharing, your observations and the possible signs that a child may benefit from our one-on-one specialist teaching. So I think time really flies when we are so engrossed in a topic that is so close to our hearts, right? So I guess it is also time for us to take a look at the questions that may come from our audience, and then we can take some time to answer them as well. So, but before that, I would like to kind of summarize what we have shared thus far from the beginning of this webinar here. So I think there are several reasons why students struggle with learning mathematics, right? It could be due to the gap between procedural knowledge and conceptual understanding, right? And then the lack of confidence, math anxiety, as well as working memory challenges. And in fact, it's not just about these three key underlying reasons, but I think some challenges can differ from one child to the other as well. So it's very important that we actually try and investigate and assess what their needs really are, right?
Error analysis.
That's right, error analysis, or what Hamada also mentioned previously, like two students may need help in fractions, but their underlying reasons for needing that help are different.
Correct.
And we need to actually look into that, right?
Yeah.
And also, at DES International, our specialist teachers are trained to support students with various diverse learning needs, right? And it's not just about teaching content only, but really to fully appreciate how each child learns. We try to tap on their strengths. We try to kind of like build up their confidence along the way, change their mindsets as well, right? Towards learning math. And lastly, I think, our math lessons here at the DES International are really designed to address foundational gaps, right? Building up the child's confidence, managing their emotions also, and also to equip students with the strategies for long-term success, right? So I think, if whether or not you are, in the audience, you are a parent or you are an educator, you are supporting a child who is struggling a lot with math, and you feel that, the child may actually benefit from one-on-one specialist teaching, feel free to write in to us. I think we are always very happy to speak with you further and discuss, how our lessons can be tailored to support our students. So once again, we thank everyone for your time and listening to us, sharing our experiences and strategies here, especially our three specialist teachers here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for attending.
Alright, so let's take a look at the questions in the Q&A.
Live question.
Live questions.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Let me just widen up the question.
Very small.
Yeah.
It's very small.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit small. Just give me a while.
Can make it bigger a bit.
Yeah. Okay, I can do this.
Mm.
It's still small. Okay. Right. Okay. Someone has an interesting question about how can we strengthen working memory in teaching a 5.5-year-old child in learning math? How can we help? 5.5 means they're actually in preschool,
Okay.
right? Yeah, maybe kindergarten,
K2.
Yes.
K2,
K2.
Yeah,
K2.
K2.
Yeah. Have you had experience working with younger children? How do we actually can support?
Working memory.
Yeah.
Actually, they learn very well with kinesthetic movements. So when they learn through songs and they have like steps, they learn very well pretty much.
That's right.
Yeah, my daughter is in a preschool stage, so she just went to P1. So
So you have that the real life
parent
experience,
yeah.
ongoing experience in
Yeah,
fact.
so they enjoy it through songs, through movements, through kinesthetic.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so too. I think for younger children, multi-sensory methods work very
multisensory.
well for them.
Yeah.
They can remember things better when there are colors.
Yes.
When there's color
and
code.
codes.
Yeah.
Like I remember I used to, color code all my operations.
Mm.
Right? And then when they have to identify the plus or the minus, they use different colors so that it helps them remember that, oh yeah, I have seen these operations, I need to work on this, and
Yeah.
kind of like help them switch their mindset
Yeah.
between I need to add on or I need to count backwards, when it comes to subtraction and things like that.
Yeah.
And songs, especially if you want to help children remember certain steps,
Yeah.
right? Or maybe simple times tables. I don't know, at preschool, I mean, I have seen parents teaching.
Maybe skip counting, right? More
Yeah.
introduce that skip counting.
Skip counting.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
So I remember there was a game that they were playing using like hopscotch. So if they are supposed to add, they are supposed to jump numbers in front, and they're supposed to steps. When they are subtracting, they are jump backwards.
That's right.
So the teacher was really doing something so multisensory.
Yes.
And you have to jump into the hula hoops. Numbers inside. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Especially if they have to do skip counting, right? They add on +2, +2, +2, or -2, -2, -2. And in fact, these are actually foundational skills for learning multiplication.
Yeah.
Right? Because multiplication is repeated addition, right? And then
correct.
division is repeated subtraction,
Mm.
right? So in a way, instead of like, getting a child to memorize the timetables, when they do these kind of activities with skip counting and all, we're actually in fact teaching them times tables.
Yes,
Yeah.
correct.
in
Yeah,
that
yeah.
sense, right?
Somewhere.
Yeah. All right. And then okay. All right. I see. Okay, I have one question here. My child is in P5. All right.
Okay.
So is it too late for him to enroll in our math classes? And then, his foundation is weak and he has many gaps between, concept and procedures. That's what we have mentioned. So what are the methodologies suggested as applicable for a child? So I guess this parent's child is P5 and has dyslexia and ADHD. Is it too late for him to enroll, and how can we help him?
Not too late at all. In fact, I would say that the examples that for mine that I took you through were in fact P5 students, two different P5 students as well. And as you can see, what we were working on was really the foundational concepts, right? Matthew talked about how these concepts build on one another. So any misconceptions from earlier or fundamental concepts will naturally be brought forward to more complex concepts. So yes, how would we work on that? As we had mentioned earlier, we were talking about concretizing or simultaneously showing them all the different representations, but of course, focusing very much on building the conceptual understanding through these manipulatives and experiences so that they're able to relate back to it. And so when they see these abstract concepts, they are able to visualize or make sense of it rather than just seeing it as numbers and memorizing steps. Not all our learners, you talk about ADHD, dyslexia, or specific learning needs. Working memory is an area that they don't have the capacity, the full capacity for that working memory. And math involves this cognitive overload, right? So how do we reduce that load? We want to make sure that their bases are solid. That way they're not memorizing and they already understand it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And especially, for a child with ADHD, generally, it's not just about the working memory part, it's also their attention span.
Yes. A paper and pen is
and in fact, many of our students, they do have ADHD as well. So I think sometimes, breaking down tasks into manageable chunks, and in fact also, shortening tasks, right, can actually help them to sustain their attention as well. So these are some of the things that we do in our classroom, especially, when a child has ADHD too. So yes, P5 is never too late. So
it's not too late.
So bring him here and then we can further explore how we can better support him. All right. Okay. So there is also another question. I guess, any one of y'all may want to answer this, because I guess this might also be a bit more relatable for older students as well, because it's asking about attempting exam paper. How can we help students in terms of attempting exam papers, and also especially for those who have extra time. I guess, it's a very common struggle for our students in terms of like managing time and attempting questions, especially difficult ones during exams, right? Matthew, do you want to try and share your experience?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so basically, how do we support students in terms of attempting exam papers? How do we help them to manage?
When they are in an exam.
When they are in an exam, or maybe in our classrooms when we are preparing them for exams, what are some of the tips that we could share with our students?
Okay, firstly, all right, when you are attempting an exam paper, the first thing you need to do is, for a particular questions, you may want to first annotate. Right, you want to annotate what are the information given, critical information, right? Because in math, whatever fact that has been given to you is going to be used. Otherwise, they won't be there, right? So you have to extract out all this critical information, right? Like just now when we have the example, right? So-and-so has got 24 apples. And then she gave away 9 and she bought another 15. So you have to annotate or highlight these numbers because they are the ones that you need to use, right? So this is what we call the parameters, the given parameters.
It's true.
Right, you highlight the given parameters, all right, and then make sure you use them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I think that's important. Yeah, annotation, I think that also helps students to link back to the specific topic that they have learned, so that they can kind of help them recall the specific steps required for that particular topic as well. Like highlighting, those key vocabulary words as well, right? Yeah. And I think also to get students to kind of time themselves. Each time we try to attempt one question on exam paper as a practice to create that self-awareness for their, so that they know how much time they actually need for a particular question and things like that.
I'd like to add, I think it's also important that we always tell our students, you must try every question, right? We want them to try every question, but it's also important that we teach them how to be strategic. So I always tell, and this is something that I think a lot of us are already practicing. Do what you know, right? And that's why, again, foundations is so important. So they know, they are very confident that they can score in that. And because they have extra time, they can come back to these questions that required a lot of annotation, or they just felt like halfway they couldn't find the answer, right? It could be an MCQ question like, why am I not getting the answer? None of it is A, B, C, or D, right? Come back to that later, so we're not wasting time.
That's true. Yeah, especially when students are stuck in a very difficult question as well. Also, the anxiety will keep building up. And we don't want that to happen because they will not be able to complete the paper eventually. So skip the question or circle it, come back later. Yeah, these are actually things that we want to
So this is an exam strategy.
Okay. That's right.
In exam strategy, the multiple choice questions, the answers are there. So if you make sure that you do well in your multiple choice questions, right?
Right.
In your preparation, because
That's right.
the answers are there.
It's true.
Yeah. I think one of the mistakes that parents or educators sometimes feel like, no, they're weak in problem sum. Like we have to make sure they're scoring problem sum, but we are not looking at what we know that they can do, which is like MCQs, right? So that's what we should be focusing on. I'm not saying ignore the problem sums, but we can build on it first by ensuring the earlier parts are more solid.
Correct. Like even in our lessons, because we always build on what they already know, and also we start from the simple to the most complex, right? So because when students know that they are able to attempt these questions, it builds their confidence. Oh, I can answer this, I can answer that, I can answer, and then eventually that actually helps with building up their confidence eventually when they have to, tackle the more difficult questions.
Correct.
All right. So I think I'm also looking at the time because we are probably running a little bit over time now. Maybe we'll just take in one last question.
Okay.
All right. Before we end off. So okay, someone is asking whether our Orton-Gillingham method for math is okay for children with ASD, especially with poor verbal comprehension.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Right.
Yes.
Matthew says yes.
Because it is language based.
That's right. Yeah.
So we have to help them understand the math language. Right. So that principle applies.
That's right. Yeah. Some people may not be aware that, actually, in fact, math is an additional language, right, for our students, because math is actually just a concept expressed through a language that we are all comfortable with. So it borrows what language that we communicate in. And sometimes the words can be confusing for them. Right? So yes, you are right, because we apply the Orton-Gillingham principles and we focus on the language used in mathematics to help students build up their understanding and their conceptual understanding as well. Right? So yes, we have actually had a wide students from a wide range of difficulties. We do have supported students with mild ASD as well. So we do understand some of the struggles that they may have. And of course, I think we are able to tailor our lessons with the application of the Orton-Gillingham approach to support students, not just with ASD, but with any other learning difficulties as well. All right, because specialist teaching, after all, is a very individualized approach in supporting our students. Okay. Yeah. So with the time, okay. So thank you so much, everybody, for for listening in to us and for your questions. And for some of the questions that we have not managed to answer them, we will actually address them after this webinar. All right, via email or something. All right. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.